The first time Lady Evelyn Carter saw the Duke of Ravensshire cough blood into a white handkerchief, the orchestra was still playing Strauss beneath 6 glittering chandeliers, and half of London was pretending not to stare. The sound itself was small, barely more than a rough breath lost beneath the music. But the silence that followed around him spread like frost across glass. Ladies lowered their fans. Gentlemen stopped speaking mid-sentence. Even the violinists seemed to falter for half a heartbeat before forcing the melody onward again. Damien Ashford, Duke of Ravensshire, stood near the grand staircase of Blackwell Hall with one gloved hand pressed lightly against his mouth, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a perfectly tailored black evening coat. Candlelight caught the sharp angles of his face and turned his pale skin almost ghost-like against the dark velvet collar framing his throat. He looked less like England's wealthiest duke and more like a man who had wandered out of a cathedral tomb and forgotten to die properly. Evelyn wished she had not noticed him. Unfortunately, she had noticed him the moment he entered the ballroom nearly 20 minutes earlier. Every woman in attendance had. That was the unfortunate thing about Damien Ashford. Even rumors of his death only seemed to make him more impossible to ignore. "Good Lord," whispered Mrs. Whitmore somewhere behind Evelyn's shoulder. "He looks worse than he did in November." Another woman sighed dramatically. "They say the physicians have given him until spring. If he survives Christmas, it will be a miracle." Evelyn lowered her gaze toward the untouched champagne in her hand. Society loved tragedies when they belonged to rich men. Particularly handsome rich men. Particularly dukes. The orchestra resumed its rhythm fully, and conversations slowly returned around the ballroom like cautious waves creeping back toward shore. Damien folded the stained handkerchief once, neatly, calmly, as though coughing blood before half the aristocracy of London was merely an inconvenience delaying his evening. Then he lifted his head. His gray eyes moved across the crowded ballroom with detached indifference. They passed over jeweled daughters, ambitious mothers, decorated officers, and smiling debutantes without pause, until they stopped on Evelyn. Her stomach tightened unexpectedly. It made no sense. She was standing near the refreshment table in a gown she had altered herself 3 separate times because there had not been enough money for a new one this season. Nothing about her invited the attention of a duke. Especially not this duke. She looked away first, felt safer. Lady Evelyn. Her younger cousin Clara appeared beside her carrying 2 lemon cakes and enough excitement for 3 people. "You vanished again. Aunt Lydia says if you continue hiding near walls, everyone will assume you dislike society." Evelyn accepted one of the cakes absently. "That would require society to notice me in the first place." Clara frowned. "You should not say things like that." "Why not? They happen to be true." At 27, Evelyn Carter had perfected the art of becoming decorative background scenery. She attended dinners, smiled politely, danced when necessary, avoided pity whenever possible. It was not an entirely unpleasant existence. Invisible women, she had learned, were often left in peace. Unfortunately, invisibility became harder to maintain when one's family was quietly collapsing financially behind polished smiles and expensive candlelight. The Carter estate in Hampshire had once employed 23 servants. Last month they had dismissed another 4. The roof above the east wing still leaked whenever it rained hard enough. Her father insisted things would recover soon. Her mother had begun selling jewelry 1 piece at a time. No one spoke openly about the debts, but Evelyn saw them everywhere. In the repaired lace at her mother's cuffs. In the thin soup served before dinner. In the letters her father burned unread after midnight whiskey. And worst of all, in the growing attention of Mr. Bernard Whitmore. Evelyn nearly lost her appetite at the thought of him. 53 years old. Widowed twice. Owner of 3 banks and an unfortunate tendency to breathe too heavily whenever speaking to unmarried women. He had spent the last month hovering around her family like a patient vulture. Her father called him practical. Her mother called him security. Evelyn privately considered him punishment sent directly from heaven. "There he is again," Clara whispered suddenly. Evelyn followed her cousin's gaze across the ballroom. Mr. Whitmore stood near the card tables speaking with her father. The older man's waistcoat strained visibly across his stomach, and the diamonds glittering at his cuffs looked almost aggressive beneath the chandeliers. Even from 30 feet away, Evelyn could recognize the expression on her father's face. Hope, desperate hope. Her chest tightened painfully. "Do not look so miserable," Clara murmured softly. "Perhaps he only wishes to discuss investments." Evelyn gave her a dry look. "Men do not stare at women that way when discussing investments." Clara opened her mouth to reply, but a sudden shift in movement near the ballroom entrance interrupted her. Conversations softened again. Heads turned instinctively. Damien Ashford was crossing the room. Not quickly. The Duke of Ravensshire moved with the controlled pace of a man conserving strength carefully. Yet the crowd parted before him all the same. Some men inspired admiration. Some inspired fear. Damien inspired silence. Evelyn had heard enough stories about him over the years to know why. The Ashford fortune stretched across half of northern England. Ravensshire coal, Ravensshire shipping, Ravensshire rail investments. If money possessed a throne in Britain, Damien Ashford sat upon it like a reluctant king. Yet despite his wealth, society never seemed entirely comfortable around him. Perhaps it was the war. Perhaps it was the illness. Or perhaps it was simply the cold distance in his eyes, as though some essential part of him had already withdrawn from the world years ago. He stopped beside Lord Everley near the dance floor. The older gentleman greeted him warmly. Damien nodded once in return. A young blonde countess attempted conversation moments later. Damien barely looked at her. Another woman laughed too loudly beside him. His expression did not change. "Imagine being handsome enough to insult everyone without consequence," Clara whispered. Evelyn almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Then Damien coughed again. Softer this time. He reached for the edge of a chair very briefly afterward, and for one strange moment, Evelyn saw it clearly. Exhaustion. Not weakness exactly. Something worse. The exhaustion of a man carrying pain so long it had become part of his posture. The realization unsettled her unexpectedly. Before she could stop herself, she took one small step forward. It was instinct more than intention. Perhaps she thought he might fall. Perhaps she simply pitied him. Whatever the reason, Damien lifted his head sharply at that exact moment. Their eyes met again. This time he did not look away. Neither did she. His gaze was not flirtatious. Not warm. It felt startlingly direct, as though he were assessing something beyond her face, beyond her gown, beyond the carefully practiced composure she wore every day of her life. Evelyn felt suddenly exposed beneath it. Then Mr. Whitmore appeared at her side. "Lady Evelyn," she nearly startled. He bowed heavily over her hand before she could withdraw it. "You are radiant tonight." That was kind of him, considering she felt approximately as radiant as an exhausted governess. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I was just telling your father that your family must join me for dinner next Thursday." His small eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "There are several matters regarding your future that deserve discussion." Evelyn's stomach turned cold. Future. Such a harmless word. Such a terrifying one. Across the ballroom, Damien Ashford was still watching her. Mr. Whitmore continued speaking. Something about property near Sussex. Evelyn barely heard him, because the Duke of Ravensshire had begun walking toward them again. Clara noticed first. Her entire posture stiffened. "Oh dear," she whispered faintly. Nearby conversations softened once more as Damien crossed the ballroom floor. No one stopped him. No one dared. Even Mr. Whitmore faltered mid-sentence when the Duke approached. Close, Damien looked worse. The candlelight could not hide the shadows beneath his eyes or the unhealthy pallor beneath his skin. Yet nothing about him felt fragile. If anything, the sharp restraint in his expression made him seem more dangerous, more controlled, like a storm forced inside human form. He stopped directly before Evelyn. Mr. Whitmore attempted a nervous smile. "Your Grace." Damien ignored him entirely. His gray eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. For one absurd second, she wondered whether he intended to criticize her gown. Then he spoke. His voice was low and roughened slightly by illness, but it carried through the silence around them with terrifying clarity. "Lady Evelyn Carter." Her pulse stumbled. "Your Grace." Another cough threatened him. She saw him suppress it visibly. His fingers tightened once against the head of his cane. Then he said the last thing anyone in the ballroom expected to hear. "Marry me." The orchestra stopped playing. Literally stopped. Somewhere across the ballroom, a violin released one awful unfinished note before silence crashed down over the entire room. Evelyn stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "I beg your pardon?" Damien did not blink. "I am asking you to become my wife." No one breathed. Clara looked moments away from fainting directly into the champagne fountain. Mr. Whitmore's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Evelyn herself could no longer feel her hands properly. This was impossible. Utterly impossible. Dukes did not propose marriage beside refreshment tables in crowded ballrooms, particularly dying dukes, particularly to women like her. "Your Grace," she managed carefully, "I believe you may be unwell." Something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly in his tired eyes. "I am dying, Lady Evelyn. Not delirious." A horrified murmur rippled through nearby guests. Evelyn's heart began pounding hard enough to hurt. Damien stepped slightly closer. Not enough to scandalize. Enough that only she could hear his next words clearly. "You need protection," he said quietly. "And I need a wife before Christmas." His gaze held hers steadily. "I believe we can help each other." Then, for the first time that evening, the Duke of Ravensshire looked truly exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, as though asking this question had cost him the last remaining piece of pride he possessed. Evelyn realized suddenly that he genuinely expected her to refuse him. The thought unsettled her more than the proposal itself. Around them, London society waited in absolute silence for her answer. For 3 full seconds, no one in the ballroom moved. The chandeliers above continued glowing warmly across polished marble floors and silk gowns, but the atmosphere beneath them had transformed completely. It no longer felt like a winter charity concert. It felt like the moment before a storm split open the sky. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. Loud, uneven, impossible to steady. The Duke of Ravensshire still stood before her with that same unnerving calm, as though asking a near stranger to marry him in front of half the aristocracy of London was a perfectly reasonable conversation. Somewhere nearby, a woman dropped her champagne glass. The sharp crack of crystal against marble shattered the silence at last. Whispers erupted instantly afterward. Soft, shocked, ruthless. Did he truly say marry him? To Lady Evelyn Carter? Surely the illness has reached his mind. No, no. Perhaps she trapped him somehow. Evelyn felt heat rush into her face. Damien, however, looked entirely untouched by the chaos surrounding them. If anything, he appeared increasingly tired. "Your Grace," she said carefully, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps this conversation would be better held privately." "Agreed." He glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance. "Would you walk with me?" Every eye in the room followed them as they crossed the ballroom together. Evelyn could practically feel the weight of speculation pressing against her shoulders. Clara looked stunned beyond speech. Mr. Whitmore appeared personally insulted by existence itself. Her father, standing near the card tables, had gone completely pale. Damien ignored all of them. A servant opened the doors leading toward the eastern gallery without being asked. Cold air drifted faintly through the quieter corridor beyond the ballroom, carrying the distant scent of snow and cedar smoke. The moment the doors closed behind them, the muffled roar of gossip disappeared into heavy silence. Evelyn released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I assume," she said slowly, "this is the point at which you explain whether you have completely lost your senses." To her surprise, something faintly amused touched Damien's expression. It vanished almost immediately beneath exhaustion. "No, I am entirely serious." They moved down the long gallery lined with oil portraits of dead aristocrats wearing expressions of permanent disappointment. Candlelight flickered across the dark paneled walls. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted quietly across the gardens of Blackwell Hall. Damien's pace was measured, careful. Evelyn noticed it more clearly now. He was conserving energy with nearly every step. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You could marry anyone. Could I?" His voice carried no vanity, only weariness. "Most women presented to me these past months are in love with my title, my fortune, or the idea of becoming a duchess before widowhood conveniently frees them again." Evelyn blinked. "That is an extraordinarily grim assessment of society." It is an accurate one. Another cough interrupted him suddenly. He turned away slightly, pressing a gloved fist against his mouth. The sound seemed to scrape painfully through his chest. Evelyn's instinctive concern rose again before she could suppress it. When he straightened, she noticed the faint tension around his jaw, as though even breathing required discipline. "You truly are ill," she said quietly. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than dramatics would have. He stopped near one of the windows overlooking the snow-covered terrace below. Candlelight reflected faintly against the glass beside his pale face. "The physicians believe I have limited time remaining." Evelyn swallowed. How limited? Perhaps months. He said it without emotion, as though discussing weather forecasts. She stared at him, uncertain how someone could speak about death so calmly. He looked no older than 33 or 34. Tall, powerful, broad-shouldered despite the visible strain illness had carved into him. Yet beneath all of that was unmistakable fatigue, the kind that settled deep inside bones. "I am sorry," she said softly before she could stop herself. Damien looked almost surprised by the words. Not suspicious, not triumphant, simply surprised. "Most people are sorry for themselves in my presence," he replied. "You may be the first person tonight who sounded sorry for me." Evelyn looked away toward the falling snow. "That is because everyone else in that ballroom sees a duke." "And what do you see?" The question lingered strangely between them. Evelyn hesitated. Honesty felt dangerous around this man. "Someone very tired," she admitted quietly. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable exactly. More fragile than that. Damien studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I need a wife before Christmas because there are matters requiring legal protection after my death." "Protection for whom?" "For you." She turned sharply toward him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded document tied with dark ribbon. "Your father's debts are substantial. Mr. Whitmore intends to use them to force your hand within weeks." Evelyn felt cold spread through her stomach. "How do you know that?" "I make it my business to know things." He held out the document. She accepted it slowly. The paper felt heavy in her gloved hands. "What is this?" "A marriage contract." She stared at him in disbelief. "You arrived tonight carrying a marriage contract?" "I did not intend to use it until next week." The absurdity of that nearly made her laugh. "Nearly. That does not make this less insane." "No," Damien agreed quietly. "It does not." Evelyn untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. The contract inside was precise, formal, already prepared by lawyers. Her breath slowed as she scanned the lines. Upon marriage, Lady Evelyn Carter would receive financial security independent of her father. Ownership rights to a London residence. Annual income substantial enough to free her family permanently from debt. Protection guaranteed after the Duke's death. She looked up sharply. "This is a fortune." "Yes. Why would you offer this to me?" Damien's gray eyes remained steady on hers. "Because I have no desire to leave this world wondering whether I spent my final months surrounded entirely by opportunists." Evelyn frowned slightly. "And you believe I am not one?" "You looked at me with pity instead of ambition." His voice lowered faintly. "Do you know how rare that has become?" The answer unsettled her deeply because she understood immediately that he was telling the truth. Wealth attracted many things. Genuine kindness was rarely among them. "You barely know me," she repeated softly. "I know enough." He moved toward the nearby fireplace where low flames flickered beneath a carved marble mantel. The warmth softened nothing about him. If anything, it emphasized how pale he looked against the firelight. "You are intelligent. Your family is struggling financially, but you continue protecting their dignity. You avoid scandal despite pressure to secure a wealthy husband quickly. You are not cruel. You are not foolish." He paused briefly. "And unlike every woman introduced to me this season, you looked concerned when I could barely breathe." Evelyn's chest tightened unexpectedly. She did not know what to do with the strange sadness rising inside her. Perhaps because he sounded less like a duke arranging marriage and more like a lonely man trying to negotiate safety before death arrived. "Your Grace," she said carefully. Marriage should not be built upon desperation. Most aristocratic marriages are built upon far less noble foundations. He sat slowly in the chair nearest the fire afterward, as though sudden exhaustion had finally reached him. For one brief second he closed his eyes. The movement revealed how truly drained he was. Evelyn noticed the faint tremor in his hand resting against the chair arm. When he opened his eyes again, composure returned immediately. But she had already seen the weakness beneath it. "If I accept," she asked quietly, "what exactly would you expect from me?" Damien's expression remained calm. Very little. Public companionship. Social appearances when necessary. Civility. He hesitated almost imperceptibly. "I am not offering romance, Lady Evelyn." Strangely, the honesty hurt more than false charm would have. "Because you are dying? Because I would not insult you with promises I cannot keep." The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, snow continued falling across the dark gardens. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the contract again. This marriage would save her family. Save her from Mr. Whitmore. Save her future entirely. Yet every instinct inside her warned that stepping into Damien Ashford's life would alter far more than her social position. There was grief surrounding him. Isolation. Secrets she could almost feel pressing against the edges of his carefully controlled composure. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why tonight?" Damien was silent for several moments. When he finally answered, his voice had grown rougher. More tired. "Because tonight was the first time I saw you look trapped." Evelyn's breath caught. He continued watching the fire instead of her. "Mr. Whitmore touched your hand. You looked as though you were preparing yourself to surrender something important simply to survive." His jaw tightened faintly. I recognized the expression. Something inside Evelyn shifted painfully at those words. Not because he pitied her. Because he understood her. The realization felt unexpectedly dangerous. Damien reached for the nearby table where a crystal glass of water had been left earlier. His hand faltered slightly before closing around it. Evelyn noticed immediately. Without thinking, she crossed the distance between them and steadied the glass before it slipped. Their fingers touched briefly. Warm skin against cool gloves. Damien went still. So did she. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet something strange passed through the silence between them. Not romance. Not yet. Recognition, perhaps. The quiet understanding of two exhausted people pretending to remain stronger than they felt. Evelyn withdrew her hand carefully. Damien looked at her for a long moment afterward. Then, very quietly, he said, "I have no future to offer you, Lady Evelyn. Only protection." The sadness in his voice nearly undid her. Because for the first time that evening, she realized the Duke of Ravensshire truly believed that was all he was worth anymore. By the following afternoon, London had transformed her engagement into entertainment. Evelyn realized this the moment she stepped from her family's carriage outside Harwood's tea salon and felt conversation stop along the entire sidewalk. Not subtly. Entirely. Ladies standing beneath striped awnings lowered their voices the instant they recognized her. Two young debutantes near the entrance stared openly before pretending sudden fascination with their gloves. A gentleman nearly walked directly into a lamp-post while turning to look at her twice. Beside Evelyn, her mother maintained the strained composure of a woman attempting not to collapse beneath equal parts triumph and panic. "Keep your chin up," Lady Carter murmured as they climbed the steps together. "People are simply surprised." Evelyn gave her a faint look. "Mother, half the city believes I have either trapped a dying duke or lost my mind. At least they are speaking of you kindly compared to yesterday evening." That was unfortunately true. The engagement announcement had spread through London before midnight. By breakfast, every drawing room, tea table, and gentlemen's club seemed to possess its own version of the story. In some versions, Damien Ashford had proposed after falling hopelessly in love with Evelyn at first sight. In others, he was allegedly so close to death that he no longer recognized social hierarchy. One particularly cruel rumor claimed Evelyn had accepted immediately while the Duke coughed blood onto the ballroom floor. She had not accepted immediately. She had not accepted at all. Not officially. Yet somehow society had interpreted her stunned silence beside Damien as confirmation enough. Worse still, Damien himself had not corrected anyone. Evelyn entered the crowded tea salon with the distinct sensation of walking onto a theater stage unexpectedly. The room was warm with conversation and heavy perfume. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished mirrors lining the walls. Every table appeared occupied by elegantly dressed women pretending not to observe her. Pretending very badly. Lady Evelyn. Mrs. Hargrove rose from her chair near the fireplace with dramatic delight. What extraordinary news! Evelyn managed a polite smile. Good afternoon, Mrs. Hargrove. The older woman clasped both Evelyn's hands tightly. The Duke of Ravensshire. My dear. London is absolutely breathless. Evelyn suspected London was breathless for reasons involving gossip rather than romance. Nothing has been formally announced, she replied carefully. Mrs. Hargrove's expression sharpened immediately with curiosity. Has it not? Before Evelyn could answer, another voice drifted across the room. Perhaps the Duke simply requires a nurse more than a wife. Soft laughter followed. Not loud enough to create open scandal. Quiet enough to remain socially acceptable. Which somehow made it worse. Evelyn turned toward the source. Lady Beatrice Holloway sat near the back windows surrounded by 3 younger women wearing expressions of vicious amusement behind jeweled fans. Beatrice herself offered Evelyn a slow smile sharpened by malice. Forgive me, she said sweetly. I merely meant that His Grace has looked terribly ill lately. Evelyn felt humiliation creep slowly up her spine. She should have expected this. Society loved romantic triumphs only when attached to youth, beauty, and uncomplicated happiness. There was nothing uncomplicated about becoming engaged to a dying duke. Particularly not for a woman many people had already quietly categorized as nearly left behind by society. The Duke of Ravensshire remains perfectly capable of speaking for himself, Evelyn said calmly. Beatrice tilted her head. For now. Another ripple of laughter followed. Lady Carter stiffened beside her daughter. Evelyn forced herself not to react visibly. Dignity, she reminded herself firmly, was often the only weapon women truly possessed in rooms like these. She was preparing to move toward an empty table when the entrance doors opened again behind her. Silence spread instantly across the salon. Not gradual silence. Immediate silence. Evelyn did not need to turn around to know who had entered. She felt the change in atmosphere before she saw him. Damien Ashford walked into the tea salon dressed entirely in dark charcoal wool. Silver snow melting faintly across the shoulders of his overcoat. 2 footmen followed several steps behind him carrying documents and parcels. The room stared openly now. No one even pretended otherwise. Damien removed his gloves slowly as though unaware he had just interrupted the social equivalent of a public execution. Then his eyes found Evelyn immediately. Always immediately. The realization unsettled her far more than it should have. Lady Evelyn, he said. The deep roughness in his voice seemed to settle directly into the silence around them. Evelyn inclined her head carefully. Your Grace. Damien glanced briefly toward Lady Beatrice and the women surrounding her. Whatever he saw there caused the temperature in his expression to cool several degrees further. Am I interrupting something? No one answered. Beatrice recovered first with a bright artificial smile. Not at all, Your Grace. We were merely congratulating Lady Evelyn. Damien regarded her for a long moment. You sounded disappointed rather than congratulatory. The smile nearly slipped from Beatrice's face. Evelyn should not have enjoyed that as much as she did. Damien crossed the room toward her afterward, moving with controlled steadiness despite the visible strain beneath his composure. Up close, the exhaustion beneath his pale features seemed more pronounced than the night before. There were shadows beneath his eyes that candlelight could no longer soften. Yet his attention remained entirely focused on Evelyn. You did not answer my note this morning, he said quietly. Evelyn blinked. Your note. One of the footmen stepped forward immediately and produced a sealed envelope. Lady Carter looked moments away from fainting again. Evelyn accepted the letter slowly. Her name was written across the front in precise masculine handwriting. She had not received any note that morning, which likely meant one of the servants had hidden it in panic before she ever saw it. Damien seemed unsurprised by this possibility. I asked whether you would accompany me to dinner tonight, he said. Around them, the salon collectively forgot how to breathe. Evelyn became acutely aware that every person in the room was listening. "Your Grace," she began carefully. "Perhaps this conversation would be more appropriate elsewhere." "No." His answer came gently but firmly. "I believe London is already discussing us quite thoroughly. We may as well save them the trouble of inventing details." To Evelyn's horror, amusement flickered briefly through several nearby expressions. Damien, however, remained entirely serious. "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked. There it was again. That strange directness. No charming performance. No rehearsed flirtation. He asked questions the way exhausted people asked for honesty because they no longer possessed energy for games. Evelyn became aware of her mother's hopeful silence beside her. Of Lady Beatrice watching eagerly for humiliation. Of half the salon waiting to see whether she would publicly reject a dying duke. "Yes," Evelyn heard herself say quietly. Something eased very faintly in Damien's expression. Relief, perhaps. The realization startled her. "Good," he replied. "My carriage will arrive at 7. Then, to the complete astonishment of everyone watching, he reached for her gloved hand. His fingers closed around hers carefully, warm despite the winter cold lingering on his coat. He bowed over her hand with restrained elegance. Yet before releasing her, his thumb brushed once very lightly against her knuckles. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, intimate anyway. Evelyn felt her pulse stumble unexpectedly. Damien straightened afterward. "Do not let cruel people convince you that kindness is weakness, Lady Evelyn," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. Then he turned toward the entrance again. The entire salon watched him leave in complete silence. The moment the doors closed behind him, conversation exploded across the room. "Good heavens! Did you see the way he looked at her? Perhaps he truly intends to marry her. But why?" Evelyn barely heard any of it. Because Damien's final words lingered uncomfortably inside her chest. "Do not let cruel people convince you that kindness is weakness." No one had ever said something like that to her before. Not her father. Not society. Certainly not men like Bernard Whitmore. For the first time since this impossible situation began, Evelyn realized something quietly terrifying. The Duke of Ravensshire did not merely want a convenient wife. He was watching her carefully, learning her, understanding parts of her life she had spent years hiding behind polite smiles. The thought followed her all the way home. Unfortunately, so did the gossip. By evening, flowers had begun arriving at the Carter residence from curious acquaintances pretending support while searching for information. Her father paced the drawing room so aggressively that the servants looked frightened. Lady Carter alternated between excitement and panic every 5 minutes. Clara nearly vibrated with romantic delusion. "A duke!" she whispered for approximately the 12th time while helping Evelyn dress for dinner. "An actual duke. Evelyn, this feels exactly like one of those serialized love stories from the magazines." Evelyn stared at her reflection wearily. Most serialized love stories do not begin with terminal illness. Clara's smile faded slightly. "Do you think he is truly dying?" The question settled heavily into the room. Evelyn looked down at the pale blue evening gown spread across her lap. She remembered Damien coughing into white linen beneath ballroom chandeliers. The exhaustion in his posture. The roughness in his breathing. The sadness hidden carefully behind restraint. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I think he is." Outside, carriage wheels rolled across the snowy street precisely at 7 o'clock. Clara hurried toward the window instantly. "He is here." Evelyn's stomach tightened unexpectedly. She rose slowly while the maid adjusted the final ribbon at the back of her gown. Her reflection looked calm enough. Only her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Downstairs, the front doors opened before the butler could even announce their guest fully. Damien Ashford stepped into the Carter residence carrying winter cold and silence with him simultaneously. He wore black again tonight. Somehow the dark color only emphasized how pale he looked beneath the entrance hall lights. Yet when he saw Evelyn descending the staircase, something in his expression shifted very slightly. Not surprise exactly. More like quiet appreciation he had not intended to reveal. "Lady Evelyn," he said softly. She reached the final step. "Your Grace." Damien offered his arm. "You look beautiful tonight." The words were simple, honest, entirely free of performance. Evelyn realized suddenly that she believed him, which felt infinitely more dangerous than charm. Her father appeared moments later with entirely transparent enthusiasm. "Your Grace, what an honor!" Damien acknowledged him politely enough. Yet his attention returned to Evelyn almost immediately afterward. "Always immediately. We should leave before the snow worsens," he said quietly. Evelyn placed her hand lightly against his arm. The fabric of his coat felt warm beneath her gloves. Strong. Steady. Yet the moment they stepped outside into the freezing night air, Damien coughed sharply again. This time the sound doubled him forward for one frightening second before he regained control. Evelyn instinctively tightened her grip on his arm. Damien straightened slowly afterward. Snow drifted around them beneath the gas lamps. For one brief moment, he looked exhausted enough to collapse directly into the street. Then composure returned like a mask sliding carefully back into place. "I am fine," he said quietly. Evelyn did not believe him at all. Neither, apparently, did the blood she saw briefly staining the edge of the handkerchief hidden against his palm. The wedding took place 12 days later beneath grey winter skies and the watchful eyes of half of London. Evelyn barely remembered most of it afterward. She remembered candlelight flickering against the stone walls of St. Bartholomew Cathedral. She remembered the weight of whispers following her down the aisle like invisible shadows. Most of all, she remembered Damien standing at the altar looking pale enough to belong among the marble saints carved into the chapel walls behind him. Yet when his eyes met hers as she approached, something softened very faintly in his expression. Not happiness exactly, relief perhaps, as though she had arrived after all and some quiet fear inside him had finally loosened its grip. The Archbishop spoke solemnly beneath stained glass windows glowing faintly with weak December light. Evelyn answered her vows with steady composure despite the thousands of anxious thoughts colliding inside her chest. Damien's voice remained low and roughened when he repeated his own vows. He did not stumble once. Yet by the time the ceremony ended, she noticed exhaustion carving deeper shadows beneath his eyes. "You may kiss the bride." The words echoed softly through the cathedral. Evelyn's pulse tightened instantly. Damien hesitated almost imperceptibly before stepping closer. The entire aristocracy of London watched them. Evelyn became aware of every heartbeat inside her body. Damien lowered his head slowly. His hand rose carefully to her cheek. Warm fingers against cool skin. Gentle. Unexpectedly gentle. Then his lips brushed her forehead instead of her mouth. A murmur swept through the cathedral immediately afterward. Some guests looked relieved. Others looked disappointed. Evelyn herself felt something stranger. Not humiliation exactly. More confusion at the restraint in that brief touch. Damien stepped back almost immediately. "Thank you," he murmured quietly enough that only she heard. The sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than the kiss itself. The reception afterward blurred into endless congratulations, forced smiles, and curiosity disguised as politeness. Women studied Evelyn with fascination usually reserved for historical disasters. Men approached Damien carefully, as though illness itself might spread through conversation. Through it all, Damien remained composed, controlled, distant. Yet every time someone spoke dismissively toward Evelyn or implied she had married for fortune alone, his attention sharpened instantly. At one point during dinner, Lord Cunningham laughed lightly over his champagne glass. Well, Lady Ravenshire certainly secured herself quickly. The table chuckled politely. Evelyn felt heat rise toward her face. Before she could respond, Damien set down his wine glass with quiet precision. "My wife did not secure anything, Cunningham," he said calmly. "I pursued her." Silence followed instantly. Lord Cunningham nearly swallowed his own tongue. Damien resumed eating afterward as though nothing unusual had occurred. Evelyn stared at him for several seconds before lowering her gaze toward her untouched plate. No one made another joke for the remainder of dinner. They departed London before dawn the following morning. Snow covered the streets in pale silver beneath the carriage lanterns. Evelyn sat across from Damien wrapped in dark blue wool and uncertainty. The title Duchess of Ravensshire still felt unreal inside her mind. So did marriage itself. The carriage moved steadily north through frozen countryside while the world outside disappeared beneath drifting winter fog. For the first several hours, Damien slept. Or rather, he drifted in and out of exhausted silence with his head resting lightly against the carriage wall. Evelyn pretended not to notice each time his breathing grew rougher. Near noon, another coughing fit seized him hard enough to wake him completely. He turned sharply away, pressing a handkerchief against his mouth while his shoulders tightened visibly beneath his coat. Evelyn reached instinctively for the water flask beside her seat. Damien accepted it afterward with a quiet nod. "Thank you." His voice sounded scraped raw. Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "You should rest more." Something faintly dry touched his expression. "You sound like my physician already." "Perhaps because your physician is correct." Damien almost smiled at that. Almost. The carriage continued northward through villages buried beneath winter snow. Evelyn gradually noticed strange details during the journey. Every innkeeper recognized Damien immediately. Every servant moved around him with unusual caution. More importantly, no one seemed surprised by his illness anymore. They behaved like people who had already spent years preparing themselves for eventual grief. The realization sat heavily inside Evelyn's chest. By the time Ravensshire estate finally emerged through the falling snow late the next evening, darkness had already swallowed most of the countryside. Evelyn stared through the carriage window in stunned silence. The estate looked less like a country house and more like something built from old legends. Massive stone walls rose against the winter sky beneath towering Gothic spires. Hundreds of glowing windows flickered warmly through the storm, while snow gathered across black iron gates and frozen gardens stretching for acres in every direction. "Good heavens!" Evelyn whispered before she could stop herself. Damien followed her gaze toward the estate. "You dislike it?" She turned toward him immediately. "Dislike it? It looks like an entire kingdom." A faint trace of amusement appeared in his tired eyes again. "It feels considerably less impressive during tax season." Despite herself, Evelyn laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. Damien looked at her strangely afterward, almost thoughtfully. The great front doors opened before the carriage fully stopped. Servants lined the entrance hall in silent rows beneath towering chandeliers. Warm firelight reflected across polished black marble floors. Somewhere deeper inside the estate, clocks chimed softly through distant corridors. The butler stepped forward first. Tall, silver-haired, immaculately composed. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said with a respectful bow. His eyes shifted toward Evelyn afterward. "Your Grace," he repeated more gently. "We are honored to receive you." Evelyn suddenly understood something important. Every servant in this house expected Damien to die. She could see it hidden carefully beneath their professionalism. The quiet grief already settling into the walls. The cautious way they watched him move. The relief each time he remained standing after another coughing spell. Ravensshire estate did not feel like a home waiting for newlyweds. It felt like a house holding its breath beside a deathbed. Damien noticed her expression immediately. "You are tired," he said quietly. "Mrs. Ellis will show you to your rooms." Rooms. Plural. Evelyn blinked. A middle-aged housekeeper stepped forward kindly. "If you would follow me, Your Grace." Damien removed his gloves slowly beside the fire. "I thought separate rooms would make you more comfortable." Evelyn hesitated. She had expected distance from him. Yet hearing it stated so plainly created an unexpected ache somewhere inside her chest. "Of course," she said softly. Something unreadable crossed his face for half a second before disappearing entirely. Mrs. Ellis guided Evelyn upstairs through endless corridors lined with portraits of long-dead Ashfords wearing expressions varying between regal and terrifying. The Duchess's suite occupied the entire eastern wing overlooking snow-covered gardens below. The rooms were beautiful, vast, elegant, entirely untouched by warmth. A fire already crackled inside the bedroom hearth. Fresh flowers stood beside the windows. New gowns had been arranged carefully inside polished wardrobes. Everything had been prepared in advance with frightening precision. Evelyn removed her gloves slowly while Mrs. Ellis helped unpack trunks nearby. "His Grace ensured everything would be ready before your arrival," the housekeeper explained gently. "He was quite particular about your comfort." Evelyn looked around the silent room. "Has the Duke always planned everything so carefully?" Mrs. Ellis hesitated briefly. Only the things that matter to him. The answer lingered strangely in Evelyn's mind long after the housekeeper departed. She changed slowly for dinner while snow tapped softly against the windows outside. The wedding ring on her finger still felt unfamiliar. So did the enormous empty bed waiting behind her reflection in the mirror. A duchess now, married to a dying man she barely understood. Downstairs, dinner proved quieter than expected. Only Damien and Evelyn occupied the enormous dining room beneath crystal chandeliers and ancestral portraits. The table itself could have seated 30 guests comfortably. Instead, the vast silence between them felt almost intimate in its emptiness. Damien ate very little, mostly tea and dry bread. Twice during dinner, he lost himself staring absently toward the fire as though exhaustion kept dragging him somewhere distant. Evelyn found herself watching him more than her meal. He looked even worse away from London society. Paler, thinner. The rigid control he maintained in public appeared harder to sustain here at home. At one point his hand tightened subtly against the edge of the table beneath another wave of pain. He recovered almost immediately afterward. Still, Evelyn noticed. Damien noticed her noticing. "You need not look so concerned," he said quietly. "I am accustomed to this. That does not make it less troubling." His gray eyes lifted toward hers across the candlelight. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Damien looked away first. "You should not become attached to a temporary situation, Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name. The softness of it unsettled her unexpectedly. "Is that what this marriage is to you?" she asked quietly. "Temporary?" Damien reached for his wine glass slowly. "Everything is temporary." The sadness hidden beneath the words lingered heavily after silence returned. Later that night, unable to sleep, Evelyn wandered briefly into the eastern corridor outside her suite. Ravensshire Estate seemed almost unnaturally quiet after midnight. Only distant fireplaces crackled softly behind closed doors. As she passed the library, voices drifted faintly through the partially open study beyond. She recognized Damien immediately. "The symptoms are worsening," another man said quietly. "A physician, perhaps. You must conserve your strength." Damien answered after a long pause. "That is no longer the priority. Your Grace, if the Duchess discovers the truth too early, she must never know." Evelyn froze instantly in the darkened corridor. Silence followed inside the study. Then another rough cough from Damien broke through the quiet. Evelyn backed away slowly before either man could notice her standing outside the door. Her heartbeat had become painfully loud again. She must never know. The words followed her all the way back toward her empty rooms while snow continued falling silently beyond the windows of Ravensshire Estate. The first week at Ravensshire Estate passed in careful silence. Evelyn quickly discovered that Damien possessed an extraordinary talent for appearing exactly when she needed protection and disappearing the moment emotional closeness threatened to follow. It was maddening and increasingly difficult to ignore. Snow continued covering the northern countryside in endless white while Christmas approached quietly beyond the estate walls. Each morning, Evelyn woke to fresh flowers arranged beside her sitting room fireplace. White roses, winter camellias, once pale blue hydrangeas despite the season. No card ever accompanied them. No explanation followed. Yet whenever she thanked the servants, they all answered the same way. His Grace requested it personally. Damien himself never mentioned the flowers once. The pattern unsettled her more than grand romantic gestures might have. He noticed everything, remembered everything, yet refused acknowledgement afterward as though kindness embarrassed him. 3 days after their arrival, Evelyn joined him for breakfast in the smaller morning parlor overlooking the eastern gardens. Weak winter sunlight filtered through frosted windows while snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Damien sat near the fire reading correspondence with one hand pressed lightly against his temple. He looked exhausted already despite the early hour. "Good morning," Evelyn said quietly. His eyes lifted immediately. Always immediately. "You slept poorly." It was not a question. Evelyn paused beside the tea table. "How could you possibly know that?" "Mrs. Ellis mentioned you requested fresh tea at 2 o'clock this morning." He folded another letter calmly. "You only do that when you cannot sleep." She stared at him. "You have known me less than a month." A faint trace of dry amusement touched his expression. You would be surprised how much people reveal through habits. Evelyn settled carefully into the chair opposite him. That sounds dangerously close to surveillance. Possibly. Another cough interrupted him before he could continue. This one lingered longer than usual. Damien turned away slightly while pressing a handkerchief against his mouth. Evelyn's appetite vanished instantly. When he finally lowered the cloth again, the sharp exhaustion in his face frightened her unexpectedly. You should remain in bed today, she said quietly. Damien reached for his tea instead. I have meetings scheduled with the estate managers. And if your health worsens? Then it worsens. The detached simplicity of the answer frustrated her immediately. You speak about your own life as though it belongs to someone else. His hand paused briefly against the teacup. Silence stretched between them. Then he looked toward the windows instead of her. Perhaps because I stopped expecting it to belong to me years ago. Before Evelyn could ask what that meant, the butler entered with fresh correspondence. Damien's expression closed instantly afterward. Whatever vulnerability had briefly surfaced disappeared beneath cold composure again. Later that afternoon, Evelyn experienced her first true lesson in what becoming Duchess of Ravensshire meant socially. Several neighboring aristocratic families arrived for tea beneath the excuse of welcoming her to the county. In reality, they came to inspect the woman who had married a dying duke. Evelyn recognized the curiosity immediately. Lady Penhest spent nearly 20 minutes pretending fascination with Evelyn's wedding gown while subtly asking whether Damien's condition had worsened since the ceremony. Mrs. Davenhill inquired with disturbing cheerfulness whether Evelyn had already discussed inheritance matters with lawyers. One woman actually asked if Ravensshire physicians expected an heir before tragedy arrives. Evelyn nearly dropped her teacup directly onto the carpet. Through it all, Damien remained seated beside the fireplace in composed silence, pale, controlled, watching everything. The conversation shifted unpleasantly after Lord Penhest laughed over his whiskey. Well, at least the Duchess will inherit one of the largest fortunes in England before 30. Several guests smiled awkwardly into their cups. Evelyn felt humiliation creep hotly into her throat. Damien set down his glass very carefully. The quiet click against the table somehow sounded louder than shouting. My wife, he said calmly, did not marry me for inheritance. Lord Penhest chuckled uneasily. Of course not, old man. We are only teasing. Damien's gray eyes lifted toward him slowly, coldly. Then perhaps improve the quality of your humor. Silence crashed across the room immediately afterward. Even the servants froze. Evelyn had never seen social discomfort spread so quickly through an aristocratic gathering. Lord Penhest turned crimson beneath his mustache. Damien, however, merely reached for his tea again as though nothing remarkable had occurred. No one mentioned inheritance for the remainder of the afternoon. After the guests finally departed, Evelyn found Damien alone beside the library fire staring absently into the flames. The fading sunlight painted long shadows across the room. He looked tired enough to disappear into them completely. You embarrassed half the county today, she said softly from the doorway. Damien glanced toward her. Only half. Despite herself, Evelyn smiled faintly. You did not need to defend me. Yes, he replied quietly. I did. Something in the certainty of the answer unsettled her. Damien leaned back slightly against the chair afterward, though the movement seemed to cost him effort. People become cruel when they smell weakness, he said. I will not allow them to treat you carelessly because of my condition. Evelyn studied him silently. You speak as though the cruelty is your fault. His gaze returned toward the fire. Often, it is easier for society to wound the woman standing beside a dying man than the dying man himself. The sadness beneath the words lingered heavily inside the room. Before she could respond, another coughing fit seized him suddenly. Worse this time. Damien bent forward sharply while gripping the edge of the chair hard enough that his knuckles whitened visibly. Evelyn crossed the room instantly without thinking. Damien. The use of his given name slipped out naturally. He looked up briefly through strained breathing. For one strange second, something vulnerable flickered openly across his exhausted face. Then it vanished again. Evelyn poured water quickly from the crystal decanter beside the fire and placed the glass carefully into his hand. Their fingers brushed. Warm skin, trembling slightly beneath controlled restraint. Damien accepted the water silently. When the coughing finally eased several moments later, he looked genuinely drained. Evelyn remained beside him anyway. Neither of them moved. "You should call for the physician," she said quietly. "No. You can barely breathe. I have survived worse evenings." Frustration tightened painfully inside her chest. "Must you insist upon suffering in silence every moment of your life?" The question escaped sharper than intended. Damien went very still afterward. The fire crackled softly between them. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed once beneath his breath. Not amusement exactly. Recognition, perhaps. "That," he said quietly, "is the first truly angry thing you have ever said to me." Evelyn folded her arms tightly. "You are impossible." "Probably." Yet despite the dry response, something gentler had entered his expression. Softer. Warmer. It vanished the moment footsteps approached outside the library. A physician entered carrying a leather medical case beneath one arm. Older. Serious-faced. He stopped immediately upon noticing Evelyn standing beside Damien's chair. "Your Grace." Damien straightened slowly. "Dr. Whitmore." The physician nodded respectfully toward Evelyn afterward. Yet she noticed something immediately. Surprise. Not because she stood in the room. Because Damien had apparently allowed it. "I came regarding your evening treatment," the doctor explained carefully. Damien's jaw tightened faintly. "Very well." Evelyn stepped back instinctively. "I should leave you to privacy." "No." Damien's answer came too quickly. All three of them noticed it. A strange silence followed. Damien looked briefly irritated with himself before speaking more calmly. "You need not leave if you prefer to stay." The physician wisely pretended this exchange was perfectly ordinary. Evelyn remained uncertain why her pulse suddenly felt unsteady again. Dr. Whitmore opened the leather case and withdrew several small medicine bottles. Dark glass. Silver caps. Damien watched the process with visible indifference. Not fear. Not concern. Indifference. That unsettled Evelyn most of all. "You have missed doses again," the physician murmured quietly while examining one nearly full bottle. Damien looked toward the fire instead of answering. Evelyn frowned slightly. "Missed doses?" Dr. Whitmore hesitated. Damien spoke before he could answer. "The treatments are unpleasant. They are intended to keep you alive," the physician replied sharply. A strange tension settled briefly across the room. Evelyn noticed it instantly. The physician looked frustrated. Damien looked exhausted beyond caring. More importantly, the medicine bottles themselves appeared almost untouched. "You are not taking them regularly," Evelyn said slowly. Damien met her gaze calmly. "No." "Why?" For the first time since she had known him, real emotion crossed his face openly. Not anger. Something quieter. Older. Tired enough to break hearts. "Because eventually," he said softly, "a man grows weary of arranging his entire life around survival." Silence followed. Even the physician stopped moving. Evelyn stared at Damien beside the firelight and suddenly understood something deeply frightening. He was not fighting to stay alive. He was enduring life because other people expected him to continue breathing. The realization hollowed something painfully inside her chest. Dr. Whitmore eventually prepared another dose while muttering under his breath about stubborn aristocrats. Damien accepted the medicine with detached resignation. He swallowed it slowly beneath Evelyn's watchful gaze. Then he set the empty glass aside without comment. The physician packed his case afterward and departed quietly. Once the door closed again, silence returned to the library. Snow drifted softly beyond the darkened windows. Damien leaned his head back against the chair, eyes briefly closed. Exhaustion carved sharply through every line of his face now. Evelyn should have left. Instead, she moved quietly toward the side table where the medicine bottles remained. 3 bottles. Nearly untouched despite weeks supposedly missing from their contents. Her stomach tightened slowly. Damien opened his eyes again as she lifted one carefully into the firelight. "You are not taking any of them properly," she said softly. He watched her in silence. The fire cracked gently between them. Then, after a long moment, Damien answered with quiet honesty that unsettled her far more than denial would have. "No," he admitted. "I am not." The library door closed behind Evelyn with a soft click that felt far louder than it should have. She stood in the dim firelit silence, still holding the edge of Damien's medical file in her gloved hands, her pulse refusing to settle into anything resembling calm. The document had slipped slightly open when she turned it, revealing lines of handwriting that did not match anything she expected to see. Not prescriptions, not treatment notes, something far more structured, calculated. She stepped closer to the fire, letting the light fall fully across the pages. The words became clearer. Legal terminology, estate directives, financial transfers. Her breath caught as she read faster, each line tightening something inside her chest. Entire properties in London, bank holdings in Manchester, shipping investments tied to the North Coast, all referenced under one repeated clause. Upon the death of Damien Ashford, Duke of Ravensshire, full control and ownership shall transfer to Lady Evelyn Carter Ashford. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Evelyn lowered the papers slowly, as though they had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Behind her, Damien's voice broke the silence. "You were not supposed to see that." She turned immediately. He was still seated by the fire, one arm resting against the chair, exhaustion etched deeper into his face than earlier that evening. Yet his expression now held something different. Not surprise, not panic, resignation. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the document. "This is not a medical file," she said quietly. "This is a plan for my entire life after your death." Damien did not deny it. That silence was worse than any explanation. The fire snapped softly between them, casting shifting shadows across his features. "How long have you been preparing this?" she asked. Her voice remained steady, but something inside it was beginning to fracture. Damien looked at the flames instead of her. "Long enough." Evelyn stepped forward, stopping just beyond the edge of the rug, where warmth faded into cold marble. "You built an entire fortune transfer for me before I even agreed to marry you." "Yes." The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than expected. "Why?" Damien finally looked at her. His gray eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with illness. "Because I needed certainty that you would not be left with nothing when I am gone." Evelyn felt her grip on the document tighten involuntarily. "And you decided that for me without asking." "I decided what I believed would protect you." "That is not protection," she said sharply. "That is control." The word landed heavily in the room. For a moment Damien said nothing. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm against his knee as though gathering what little strength remained. "Do you think I wanted this?" His voice was quieter now, rough around the edges. "Do you think I wanted to build an entire future for someone I intended to leave behind?" Evelyn's anger faltered briefly, not because it disappeared, because something in his tone sounded dangerously close to pain. "Then why not tell me the truth?" she asked more softly. "Instead of letting me discover it in documents hidden inside your study?" Damien exhaled slowly. "Because the truth changes things." Evelyn stared at him. "It already has." Silence stretched again. Outside the library windows, snow pressed softly against the glass like a distant memory of the world beyond Ravensshire estate. Damien rose slowly from his chair. The movement looked measured, controlled, but Evelyn noticed the slight hesitation in his breath as he straightened. He crossed toward the desk near the far wall where additional documents were stacked in careful order. When he spoke again, his voice carried less weight than before. "You were never meant to see any of it before I had no choice." Evelyn followed him cautiously. "And when exactly were you planning to tell me?" Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the drawers and withdrew another folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her, all sealed, all dated in sequence. Evelyn froze. "Are those?" Damien placed them on the desk carefully. "Yes." She stepped closer, her breathing tightening. "Why are there so many?" "Because I did not know which version of the truth I would survive long enough to tell you." The room felt colder suddenly. Evelyn picked up the top letter with slightly trembling fingers. Her name was written across it in the same precise handwriting she had come to recognize. She did not open it. Not yet. "You wrote me letters you never sent," she said quietly. "Why?" Damien's gaze lowered slightly. "Because I wanted you to know me," he said simply. "Even if I never managed to say the words aloud." Evelyn looked up sharply. "You speak as though you are already gone." Damien met her eyes then. Fully. Directly. "Every man like me learns to think in terms of what remains unfinished." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than anything else that night. She set the letter back down carefully. "You are still alive," she said. "Barely," he replied. The words should have sounded dramatic. They did not. They sounded factual. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "You cannot build my entire future around your absence while you are still standing in front of me." A faint shift crossed his expression. "I built it because I will not always be standing in front of you." The fire cracked softly again. Neither of them moved. Then Evelyn did something she did not fully understand in the moment. She stepped forward and placed the medical file firmly onto the desk between them. The sound was sharper than intended. Damien looked at it, then at her. "You are not afraid of what happens after I die," she said quietly. "You are already living as though it has happened." For the first time since she had known him, Damien did not have an immediate response. The silence that followed felt heavier than all the conversations before it. "You are wrong," he said finally. Evelyn held his gaze. "Then stop acting like I am already a widow." Something flickered across his face at that word. Brief, unstable, human. He turned slightly away from her, one hand pressing against the edge of the desk as though the weight of standing suddenly became more difficult. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you do not understand what it means to be in my position." She stepped closer again, refusing to let distance become an answer. "Then explain it to me." Damien closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his expression had shifted. Not softer, just more tired. "It means," he said slowly, "that every decision I make already assumes I will not be here to regret it." Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. "That is not living," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It is surviving." The word hung between them, heavy, unfinished. Outside, the snow continued falling over Ravensshire Estate, covering the world in silence that felt strangely like waiting. And for the first time since their marriage, Evelyn understood something she had not been prepared to accept. Damien Ashford was not simply preparing to die. He was trying to make sure that when it happened, she would never be left unprotected by the life he was leaving behind. Evelyn did not sleep that night. The letters remained on her desk like silent accusations, each one sealed with the same precise handwriting, each one carrying a version of Damien Ashford she had never been allowed to meet. At some point before dawn, she found herself sitting by the window wrapped in a wool shawl, watching snow bury the gardens of Ravensshire Estate in slow, patient silence. The world outside looked untouched by secrets. Inside, everything had shifted. When morning finally arrived, she made her decision without announcing it to anyone. The corridors of the estate were still quiet when she left her rooms, moving past portraits of long-dead Ashfords whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with judgmental patience. She carried only one of Damien's unopened letters in her hand. Not to read it, not yet, only to remind herself why she was walking toward the East Wing where she knew he often spent the early hours alone. She found him in the library. As always, he was already awake. Damien stood near the tall windows with a document in his hand, his coat unbuttoned, his posture slightly angled as though even standing required careful negotiation with exhaustion. The fire behind him burned low, casting faint amber light across the room's heavy shelves. For a moment he did not notice her. Evelyn watched him quietly from the doorway. There was something different about him this morning. Not physically. That had not changed. The pale exhaustion still clung to his face, the faint tremor of restraint still visible in the way he held himself. But there was a stillness in him that felt deeper than fatigue, felt like distance, as though part of him had already stepped away from the world entirely and was simply waiting for the rest to follow. "You are awake early," she said finally. Damien turned his head slightly. "You are awake at all." It was not a question. Evelyn stepped into the room, the unopened letter still held firmly in her hand. "I could not sleep." A faint pause followed before he nodded once. "Neither could I." She moved closer to the desk where several documents remained scattered from the night before. Legal papers, medical notes, the quiet architecture of a life being arranged in advance for absence. Evelyn placed the letter gently on top of them. Damien's eyes shifted toward it immediately. He did not reach for it. "I brought one of them," she said quietly. "I still have not read it." "You should not have taken it from the drawer," he replied softly. "You should not have written so many," she countered. Silence settled between them. Outside, wind pressed faintly against the glass like a distant reminder that the world still continued regardless of what they chose to say inside this room. Damien finally set the document in his hand aside. Slowly, carefully, as though even small movements had begun to cost more than they used to. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "those letters are not for now." "Then when are they for?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the fireplace, stopping just close enough for warmth to reach him without requiring effort to stand closer. "For after," he said at last. The word landed heavily. Evelyn followed him, stopping a few feet away. "After what?" Damien's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "After I am no longer here to explain myself badly in person." The bluntness of it should have been unbearable. Somehow it was not. It was worse than that. It was familiar. "You keep speaking as though your absence is already settled," she said quietly. Damien's expression tightened faintly. "It is settled. The question is only timing." Evelyn stepped closer again, frustration rising beneath her composure. "You are still standing in this room, Damien. You are still breathing. You are still arguing with me." A faint, almost tired exhale left him. "That does not change the outcome." The words should have felt cold. Instead, they felt practiced, as though he had repeated them to himself so many times they no longer required emotion to exist. Evelyn studied him carefully. Something inside her resisted accepting this version of him. Not the dying Duke. Not the man preparing for departure. But the man who had written dozens of letters to her without sending a single one. The man who defended her in silence before entire rooms of aristocrats. The man who remembered when she did not sleep. "You are wrong," she said quietly. Damien finally looked at her fully. "About what?" "About believing there is nothing left to change." A long silence followed. The fire snapped softly between them. Outside, snow lightened against the windows as morning slowly arrived. Damien's voice lowered slightly when he spoke again. "You think I have control over what is happening. I think you have more control than you allow yourself to believe." Something flickered briefly in his eyes. Not disagreement. Not acceptance. Something more complicated. "That is a dangerous assumption," he said. Evelyn took a slow breath. Then, without warning, she stepped past him toward the desk where his correspondence was still arranged. Damien did not stop her. She began opening drawers carefully, not searching wildly, not intruding without purpose. Simply following instinct she did not fully understand yet. Damien watched her in silence, his posture still controlled but more alert now. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Finding out what you refused to say out loud," she replied. In the third drawer she found what she was not expecting to find at all. A thin sealed envelope marked with a date from several years earlier. The handwriting was Damien's, but the ink was faded differently, older. She turned it slightly toward the light. "This predates our marriage," she said quietly. Damien's expression changed immediately, not sharply, but enough for her to notice, enough to confirm everything. "Evelyn," he said carefully. She opened it before he could stop her. The letter inside was brief, far shorter than the others she had seen. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to no one at all. Yet the first line made her chest tighten instantly. "If I do not survive long enough to change the outcome, then everything I have built must ensure she is never left unprotected." Evelyn lowered the letter slowly. She repeated quietly. Damien did not speak. The silence between them became absolute. Evelyn looked up at him slowly. "You were not speaking about me originally." His jaw tightened faintly. "No." The answer should have been simple. Instead it felt like something far larger had just entered the room with them. "Who is she?" Evelyn asked. Damien's gaze remained steady, but something behind it had shifted. "Someone I failed once already," he said quietly. The words landed differently than anything before them. Not mysterious, not vague, personal. Evelyn stepped closer again, her voice lower now. "And you planned your entire future around preventing that failure from repeating." Damien did not deny it. That silence answered more than any confession could have. Evelyn's grip on the paper loosened slightly. "So this marriage," she said slowly, "this protection, this fortune transfer, all of it was not only about me." Damien finally looked away. "It was never meant to be only about you." The truth should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like depth. Something larger than her own expectations. Something that had existed long before she ever stepped into his life. Evelyn set the letter down carefully on the desk. Her voice softened slightly when she spoke again. "Then why me?" Damien hesitated. For the first time since she had known him, the answer did not arrive immediately. When it came, it carried less certainty than before. "Because you looked at me as if I was still a person," he said quietly. The simplicity of it struck her harder than anything else that morning. Outside, the estate continued waking slowly beneath pale winter light. Inside the library, Evelyn Carter realized something she had not been prepared to understand yet. She had not been chosen by accident. And she had not been chosen only for protection either. She had been chosen because somewhere inside Damien Ashford's carefully constructed future, she had become something he could not afford to lose again. The fever arrived without warning on the third night after their conversation in the library. At first, Evelyn thought it was nothing more than exhaustion, finally catching up with Damien after weeks of ignoring his own limits. He had insisted on attending a late meeting with estate advisors despite her objections. He had returned just before midnight, pale even by his usual standards, but still upright, still pretending control belonged to him. By dawn, that illusion had collapsed. Evelyn found him in his bedroom before the servants had fully begun their morning duties. The fire had gone low overnight, and the vast room felt colder than it should have. Damien lay partially upright against the pillows, one arm resting loosely across his chest, his breathing uneven in a way that immediately tightened something inside her. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway, unsure whether what she was seeing was real or the result of exhaustion in her own mind. Then he shifted slightly, and the faint sound of strained breath confirmed it. "Damien," she said quietly. His eyes opened slowly. He did not appear surprised to see her, only tired. "You should not be here yet," he murmured. Evelyn moved immediately toward the bed. "You are burning with fever. I have had worse nights. That is not comforting." He exhaled faintly, almost a shadow of amusement, but it faded quickly into discomfort as another wave of heat passed through him. Evelyn reached for the bell cord, but Damien stopped her with a slight movement of his hand. "No physicians," he said quietly. "We already discussed this." "We are discussing it again," she replied firmly. The weakness in his voice unsettled her more than anything she had seen before. It was not dramatic. It was controlled, endured. That was what made it frightening. Evelyn pressed her hand briefly against his forehead without thinking. The heat beneath her palm confirmed everything she feared. Damien closed his eyes for a moment at the contact, then opened them again slowly. "You are shaking," he observed. "I am not the one with a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, she said. His gaze softened slightly. "You measured it." "Of course I measured it." Silence followed. The fire cracked softly across the room. Outside, snow continued falling across Ravensshire Estate like an endless, indifferent curtain. Evelyn pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "How long have you been ignoring your treatments?" she asked quietly. Damien did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before. "Long enough for it not to matter anymore." Evelyn looked at him sharply. "It matters to me." That seemed to register differently than anything else she had said. Damien's eyes shifted slightly toward her, more focused now despite the fever dulling his strength. "You should not say things like that so easily," he said. "Why not?" "Because people believe them." Evelyn hesitated. Something inside her tightened unexpectedly at the warning in his tone. Perhaps I do. Damien's expression changed faintly at that. Not disbelief. Not hope. Something more fragile than either. Before he could respond, another coughing fit seized him, harsher than the previous night. His entire frame tensed as he turned slightly away, struggling to suppress it. Evelyn stood immediately, instinct overriding hesitation. She placed a glass of water in his hand and supported his shoulder lightly until the coughing eased. When it finally did, Damien leaned back against the pillows again, visibly drained. "This is what you have been enduring alone," she said quietly. He did not deny it. That silence again. Evelyn sat back down slowly, her frustration giving way to something heavier. "You refuse help even when it is offered," she said. "You refuse treatment even when it might extend your time." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Extension is not the same as recovery. That does not mean you stop trying." His gaze lowered slightly. "You are speaking as if survival is always worth the cost." Evelyn frowned. "Is it not?" Damien did not answer immediately. The firelight shifted across his face, revealing how truly exhausted he looked beneath everything he tried to maintain. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost detached. "There are costs you do not understand yet." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "Then explain them to me." A long silence followed. Damien's hand rested loosely against the blanket now, no longer attempting to hide the tremor there. "I have already lived past what I thought I would survive," he said. "Everything after that feels like borrowed time." Evelyn felt something tighten painfully in her chest. "That is not a reason to give up on it." His eyes met hers again, more focused now despite the fever. "It is not giving up," he said quietly. "It is acceptance." Evelyn shook her head slightly. "Acceptance without fight is surrender." A faint, tired breath left him. "You think I have not fought." The words were not sharp. They were exhausted. That difference mattered more than she expected. Evelyn looked at him more carefully then. Truly looked. Not at the Duke. Not at the reputation. At the man lying in front of her trying to breathe through pain he had clearly stopped asking anyone to share. "Who was she?" Evelyn asked suddenly. Damien's eyes flickered slightly. "The woman you keep building your future around saving." Silence followed immediately. The question landed differently this time. He did not dismiss it. He did not redirect it. Instead, something in his expression shifted into something far more distant. "Her name was Catherine," he said quietly. Evelyn stayed still. Damien continued staring at the fire as though the memory itself required distance to survive. "She was my wife," he said. The words struck the room with unexpected weight. Evelyn felt her breath tighten slightly but said nothing. Damien's voice remained steady, though quieter now. "She was kind in a way that made people underestimate her intelligence. She trusted too easily, believed too much in people who did not deserve it." He paused briefly. "I failed to protect her." Evelyn's chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Damien's jaw tightened faintly. For the first time since she had known him, his composure faltered in something almost imperceptible. Not collapse. Not emotion. Memory resisting restraint. "An illness," he said finally. "One I could not stop." The simplicity of it made it worse. Evelyn looked down for a moment, processing the shift in everything she thought she understood. "And you believe that makes you responsible for everything after?" Damien's gaze returned to her slowly. "I know it does." Evelyn shook her head. "That is not how responsibility works. It is how memory works." The fire snapped softly. Outside, snow pressed harder against the windows as though winter itself was listening. Evelyn stood slowly. She moved toward the fireplace, stopping just beside it where warmth met shadow. "You are not still in that moment," she said quietly. Damien did not respond. Evelyn turned back toward him. "You are here, in this room, with me." His eyes lifted slightly at that. Something flickered there again. Not hope, not yet, but something close enough to disturb the stillness he had built around himself. "That does not change what I owe her," he said. Evelyn stepped closer again, her voice steady now. "And what do you think you owe her?" Damien hesitated. the first real hesitation she had seen from him in days. "To make sure nothing like that happens again," he said quietly. Evelyn understood then, not fully, but enough to see the shape of the prison he had built for himself. Not illness, not death, guilt carried forward like inheritance. She sat back down beside the bed slowly. "Damien," she said softly, "you are not living in order to protect her anymore. You are surviving in order to punish yourself." His eyes closed briefly at that. Not in denial, in exhaustion. The fire continued to burn between them. Outside, the estate remained buried beneath snow and silence. And for the first time since their marriage began, Evelyn realized the greatest secret Damien Ashford had been hiding was not about death at all. It was about the part of him that had stopped believing he deserved to live beyond it. The physician returned 2 days later without being summoned. Evelyn found him in the lower corridor speaking in hushed tones with Mrs. Ellis, both of them standing too rigidly near the wall as though afraid the estate itself might overhear. When they noticed her approaching, their conversation stopped instantly. That alone told her everything she needed to know. "Lady Ravenshire," the physician said carefully. "I was hoping to speak with His Grace privately." Evelyn's grip tightened slightly on the fabric of her sleeve. "He is resting." The physician hesitated. "It is important." The words were chosen too precisely, too cautiously. Evelyn did not move aside immediately. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, noticing the strain in his expression, the way his hands remained folded tightly over his medical case. Finally, she nodded once. "I will not leave him alone," she said. The physician gave a faint nod of reluctant agreement. The door to Damien's room opened with a soft creak. He was awake when she entered, though barely. The fire had been replenished but still struggled against the winter chill that seeped through Ravenshire's ancient stone walls. Damien lay slightly turned toward the window, one arm resting loosely across the blanket. His eyes opened as she approached. "You should not have brought him here," he said immediately. Evelyn paused beside the bed. "He insisted. They always insist when they believe death has become a schedule." The physician entered quietly behind her, closing the door with care. He did not sit. He remained standing near the foot of the bed, opening his case slowly. Damien watched him without expression. Evelyn moved closer to the chair beside the bed but did not sit yet. Something in the room felt heavier than before. Not fear. Not exactly. Certainty. "Your Grace," the physician began carefully, "we have received additional confirmation regarding your condition." Damien exhaled slowly. "I assume it is unchanged." The physician hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Evelyn felt something tighten inside her chest. Damien did not react immediately. He simply stared at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking again. "How much time now?" The physician looked down briefly. "It is difficult to estimate precisely. Several months, perhaps less depending on exertion." Silence filled the room. Outside, wind pressed against the windows in slow, restless waves. Evelyn found herself suddenly unable to speak. Damien, however, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "That is acceptable," he said quietly. The physician frowned slightly. "Your Grace, there are treatments we can still attempt." "No," Damien interrupted gently. Not harshly, firmly. "There are not." Evelyn finally stepped forward. "Damien," she said quietly. He turned his head slightly toward her. "Do not negotiate with him," she added. The physician looked between them uneasily. "My lady, with continued care there is always—" "No," Damien said again, softer this time. "There is not." The finality in his voice ended the discussion in a way no medical opinion could. The physician closed his case slowly. "I will prepare updated instructions for your household," he said reluctantly. Damien gave a faint nod. The man left without another word. The door closed softly behind him. Silence returned immediately. Evelyn remained standing beside the bed, her hands clenched loosely at her sides. Damien did not look at her at first. When he finally did, there was something different in his expression. Not resignation, not fear. Something closer to exhaustion that had become permanent. "You did not have to hear that," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head slightly. I already knew. A faint pause followed. How? He asked. She hesitated. Because you stopped arguing with it. That seemed to land more heavily than expected. Damien looked away again toward the window. Snow continued falling beyond the glass in slow, endless silence. There is no argument left to make, he said. Evelyn moved closer to the bed and finally sat down in the chair beside him. Then make a different one, she said. Damien's gaze returned to her slowly. Such as? Evelyn hesitated, then spoke carefully. Such is why you are still preparing my entire life as though I will need it without you. Something flickered in his eyes. Because you will. That is not an answer. A faint breath left him. Not quite a sigh. More like acceptance of inevitability. Evelyn, he said quietly. I have already lived past what I was meant to. She shook her head immediately. No one is meant to die at a specific time just because suffering suggests it. Damien studied her for a long moment. You still think suffering is accidental. Is it not? Silence stretched between them again. The fire snapped softly behind her. Damien shifted slightly in the bed, wincing faintly as he adjusted his weight. Evelyn noticed immediately and leaned forward instinctively. Do not move, she said. A faint trace of dry humor touched his expression. You are beginning to sound like my physician. Then perhaps I am learning something useful. That earned a faint exhale that might have been amusement if not for how tired it sounded. Evelyn hesitated before speaking again. Why did you never tell me the full truth about your condition? Damien's gaze lowered slightly. Because there is no version of it that improves with explanation. That is not true. He looked at her again. Is it not? Evelyn hesitated. You could have let me choose knowing everything. Pause followed. And would you have chosen differently? The question caught her unexpectedly. She opened her mouth, then stopped. The honesty of it unsettled her. Damien watched her carefully now. That is why I did not tell you, he said quietly. Because I needed your answer without the shadow of pity or obligation. Evelyn frowned slightly. You think I would have married you out of pity? Most people would. The simplicity of his belief frustrated her. I am not most people, she said firmly. Damien studied her for a long moment. No, he said finally. You are not. The room fell into silence again. Outside, the wind shifted slightly against the estate, carrying distant echoes through the stone corridors. Evelyn lowered her voice. You are afraid of being remembered as weak. Damien did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. I am afraid of being remembered incorrectly. That answer lingered heavily in the air. Evelyn leaned back slightly in the chair, trying to understand the shape of him more clearly. Not the Duke. Not the illness. The man beneath both. Catherine, she said suddenly. Damien looked at her immediately. The name changed something in the room. Evelyn continued carefully. You still believe everything that happened to her defines everything that happens to you. Damien's jaw tightened faintly. It defines responsibility. It defines fear, she corrected softly. Silence followed. Then Damien spoke, quieter now. She trusted people too easily. Evelyn nodded slowly. And you stopped trusting anyone at all. That landed differently. He did not deny it. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Damien, she said softly. You are not failing her by surviving longer than she did. His expression tightened faintly at the words. Not anger. Something closer to pain. You do not understand what it means to watch someone disappear when you were supposed to protect them, he said quietly. Evelyn hesitated, then answered gently. No, she said, but I understand what it means to watch someone disappear while still standing beside them. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Damien closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his expression had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but slightly less guarded. You should rest, Evelyn said softly. He nodded faintly without argument this time. Evelyn remained in the chair beside him long after his breathing slowed into sleep. Outside, snow continued falling across Ravensshire estate, covering the world in quiet layers of white. And for the first time since the physician's arrival, Evelyn realized something that changed everything she thought she understood. Damien Ashford was not simply dying. He had already begun letting go long before anyone else was ready to stop him. The night after the physician left Ravensshire estate felt different in a way Evelyn could not immediately name. The corridors were still silent. The snow still pressed against the windows in slow, patient waves. The fire in Damien's room still burned low and steady as it always did. Yet something inside the house no longer felt held together by certainty. Felt exposed. Evelyn noticed it the moment she entered his chamber before dawn. Damien was already awake, sitting upright against the pillows, dressed in a dark sleeping coat. His gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the foot of the bed. Not reading, not resting, waiting. "You did not sleep," she said quietly. He did not turn his head immediately. "Neither did you." Evelyn paused near the chair beside him. "That is becoming a pattern." A faint trace of something like dry amusement crossed his expression. Patterns are easier to manage than uncertainty. She studied him carefully. The exhaustion in his face had deepened overnight. Not dramatically, subtly, like erosion rather than collapse. "You should not be alone at night," she said. Damien finally looked at her. "I am always alone at night." The simplicity of the statement unsettled her more than anything else he had said recently. Evelyn moved closer and sat down. "That is not something you should accept as normal." He did not answer. Outside, the wind shifted sharply against the estate, carrying distant sounds through the ancient stone walls. A long silence stretched between them before Damien spoke again. "There is something you should understand," he said quietly. Evelyn frowned slightly. "About what?" He hesitated. That alone was unusual enough to draw her attention fully. Damien rarely hesitated. When he did, it always meant truth was approaching something uncomfortable. "About why I brought you here," he said. Evelyn's posture tightened slightly. "I thought we already established that." "Not fully." He leaned back slightly against the headboard, closing his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "You believe this marriage began as protection for you." Evelyn nodded slowly. "It did." "It did," he agreed, then paused. "But it also began as something else." A faint unease settled in her chest. "Explain." Damien looked toward the fire instead of her. "There are people who do not want me to survive long enough to complete my legal affairs." Evelyn's expression sharpened immediately. People, business rivals, family branches that would benefit from instability. Individuals who would prefer Ravensshire holdings fractured rather than intact. His voice remained calm, but something harder underlined the words now. Controlled awareness. Not paranoia. Experience. Evelyn stood slowly. "Are you saying your illness is not entirely natural?" Damien did not answer immediately. The pause itself was answer enough. "There were attempts," he said finally. Evelyn felt a cold tightening inside her chest. Attempts at what? Damien's gaze remained steady. At accelerating outcomes that were already expected. The phrasing was deliberately careful. Too careful. Evelyn took a step closer to the bed. "Why are you telling me this now?" Damien looked at her directly. "Because the physician confirmed something yesterday that changes the timeline." Silence fell instantly. Evelyn felt her pulse sharpen. "What timeline?" Damien's voice lowered slightly. "Mine." The word landed heavily between them. Outside, snow struck the window in faint irregular patterns. Evelyn's hands tightened slightly at her sides. "How much time?" she asked quietly. Damien exhaled slowly. "Less than previously estimated." The room felt colder after that sentence. Not physically, emotionally. Evelyn sat down again slowly, her mind struggling to process the shift. "And instead of telling me immediately," she said carefully, "you chose to prepare more documents." Damien did not deny it. "Yes." Evelyn shook her head slightly. "You are not thinking about survival at all anymore." He looked at her then. Fully. "I am thinking about consequences," he said. The distinction unsettled her. "Those are not the same thing." "For me, they are." A long silence followed. The fire crackled softly. Damien shifted slightly, wincing faintly as fatigue moved through him again. Evelyn noticed immediately. Without thinking, she reached forward and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. The contact made him still briefly, not resisting, not reacting, simply acknowledging. You are planning as if every day is your last, she said quietly. Damien's eyes lowered slightly. Every day might be. Evelyn hesitated, then spoke more firmly. That is not a way to live. A faint breath left him. It is the only way I have learned not to waste time. Evelyn sat back slowly, studying him more carefully now. Damien, she said quietly, you are not only preparing for your death, you are preparing for someone else to use it. His expression changed slightly at that. Not denial, recognition. Evelyn continued before he could interrupt. These documents, the estate transfers, the letters, they are not only for me after you are gone. Damien's jaw tightened faintly. No. The answer was immediate. Too immediate. Evelyn leaned forward. Then who else are you protecting me from? Silence stretched again. Longer this time. More deliberate. Damien finally spoke. From what happens after I am no longer a barrier between you and them. The phrasing made her stomach tighten. Them? She repeated. Damien looked toward the window again. The people who will see you as vulnerable once I am gone. Evelyn felt a slow realization forming. You are not only planning for your absence, she said quietly. You are preparing for the moment I become exposed. Damien did not answer directly. That was answer enough. Evelyn stood again, pacing slowly toward the fire. Her thoughts were no longer scattered. They were aligning into something sharper. That is why you married me, she said. Not only to protect me from debt. Not only because of Catherine. Damien watched her silently. Evelyn turned back toward him. You married me because you believe I will be targeted after you die. Faint pause. Then he spoke. Yes. The simplicity of it was worse than denial. Evelyn felt something tighten painfully inside her chest. So the entire structure of our marriage, she said slowly, was built around an assumption that I will become a liability the moment you are gone. Damien's gaze remained steady. A vulnerability, he corrected quietly. Evelyn let out a slow breath. That is not how I see myself. It is how they will see you, he replied. The certainty in his voice made her stop. Not because she agreed, because she realized he believed it completely. Evelyn walked back toward him slowly. Damien, she said softly, you are not the only person capable of understanding danger. His eyes met hers again. I know. Then why do you still treat me like someone who cannot survive without your instructions already written in advance? A faint tension crossed his expression. Because I have seen what happens when people assume strength where none has been tested. Evelyn shook her head slightly. I am not Catherine. The words landed differently this time. Damien closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his expression had softened. Not healed, but changed. I know, he said quietly. The silence that followed was no longer defensive. It was something more fragile. Evelyn sat down again slowly beside the bed. If your fear is what happens after you are gone, she said carefully, then perhaps the solution is not to prepare for my survival alone. Damien looked at her quietly. What do you mean? Evelyn hesitated, then spoke with quiet certainty. Perhaps the solution is to make sure you are not removed from the equation so easily in the first place. For the first time that morning, Damien did not respond immediately. And in that silence, something shifted between them again. Not resolution, not clarity, but the beginning of resistance against inevitability itself. Evelyn knew something was wrong the moment she entered the east wing and found Damien's room empty. The fire had burned down to pale ash. The sheets were undisturbed in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. And the entire space carried a stillness that did not belong to a man who was supposed to be resting after a fevered night. For a few seconds she simply stood there, listening to the silence as though it might explain itself. Then she turned sharply and left the room without calling for a servant. The corridor outside felt longer than usual, every portrait watching her pass with unfamiliar weight. When she reached the lower hall, Mrs. Ellis was already there, pale-faced and rigid with unease. Where is the Duke? Evelyn asked immediately. The housekeeper hesitated just long enough to confirm Evelyn's fear. His Grace left before dawn, my lady. The words did not make sense at first. Evelyn blinked once. Left where? Mrs. Ellis lowered her gaze. He did not say. A cold sensation spread through Evelyn's chest. "He is ill," she said firmly. "He should not be traveling." "The physician was called during the night," Mrs. Ellis replied quietly. "Afterward, His Grace dismissed him." Evelyn felt her pulse tighten. "Dismissed him?" The housekeeper nodded faintly. "He refused further treatment." The hallway seemed to narrow around her. Evelyn turned immediately toward the front doors without another word. Outside, the estate grounds stretched under a pale winter sky, snow falling in different layers across the frozen gardens. A carriage track had already formed in the fresh snow leading away from Ravensshire. Not toward the village, toward the northern road. Evelyn stepped forward into the cold without hesitation. The chill struck sharply through her coat, but she barely felt it. One of the stable hands hurried toward her. "My lady, you should not be outside in this weather." "When did he leave?" she demanded. The man hesitated. "Just before sunrise. Alone." Evelyn turned sharply toward the open gates. "Did he say anything?" The stable hand looked uncertain. "Only that he would return when there was nothing left to settle." The words landed with quiet finality. Evelyn did not wait for further explanation. She gathered her skirts and walked directly toward the stable yard. "Prepare a carriage," she said. "Now." The urgency in her voice left no room for argument. Within minutes, she was seated inside a traveling carriage moving away from Ravensshire Estate at a speed that made the world outside blur into streaks of white and gray. Snow struck the windows in uneven patterns as the carriage rattled northward along the frozen road. Evelyn sat rigidly upright, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The thought that refused to leave her mind was simple and unbearable. He had chosen to leave while she slept. Hours later, they reached a small estate physician's lodge on the outskirts of the county. Evelyn stepped out of the carriage before it fully stopped. The physician from Ravensshire was already standing at the entrance, as though expecting her arrival. His expression confirmed everything before he spoke. "Where is he?" Evelyn asked immediately. The physician hesitated. "My lady, I advised against him traveling." "Where is he?" she repeated, her voice sharper now. A long pause followed. Then the physician exhaled slowly. "He left instructions with me before departing." Evelyn's heart tightened. "What instructions?" The physician reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter. Evelyn stared at it for a moment before taking it. The wax seal bore the Ravensshire crest. Her name was written across the front in Damien's precise handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The physician remained silent beside her while she read. The letter was shorter than she expected. That alone felt wrong. "Evelyn, I cannot continue treatment that only delays what I have already accepted. I stopped years ago in ways you are only now beginning to understand. The illness was never the only thing I was carrying. The rest was guilt I never learned how to release. Meeting you did not change what is coming. It only changed what I wish I had time to become before it arrives. Do not search for me in the places I used to hide. I am not hiding anymore. I am simply finishing what I should have faced long before you entered my life." Evelyn lowered the letter slowly. Her throat felt tight, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Where did he go?" The physician looked at her with reluctant honesty. "To London, my lady." Evelyn's grip tightened on the paper. "Why?" The physician hesitated again. "He said there is something unfinished that cannot remain so any longer." Without another word, Evelyn turned back toward the carriage. The journey south felt longer than the one before it, not because of distance but because of certainty growing heavier with every mile. By the time London's skyline appeared through the snow, evening had already begun to fall. Gas lamps flickered faintly along the streets as the carriage slowed near the city center. Evelyn stepped out into the cold air again, her breath visible in sharp clouds. She did not need direction. Something inside her already knew where he would be. The grand winter assembly at Ashbourne Hall was still underway when she arrived. Carriages lined the street in endless rows, and the glow of chandeliers spilled through tall windows onto snow-covered steps. Music drifted faintly from within, though it sounded distant, almost fragile. Evelyn moved through the entrance without waiting for announcement. Inside, the ballroom was filled with London's elite. Conversations faltered almost instantly as she entered alone, her presence cutting through the elegance like a quiet disruption. Heads turned. Whispers followed. Evelyn did not stop walking. At the far end of the room, near the marble staircase beneath the largest chandelier, Damien stood alone. Not seated, not resting, standing. He was dressed in black, as though mourning something no one else had been informed about. His posture was steady, but there was a stillness around him that felt final rather than composed. When his eyes found hers across the room, something shifted immediately in his expression. Not surprise, not regret, recognition. Evelyn crossed the ballroom without hesitation. The crowd parted instinctively, though she barely noticed. Every step felt louder than the music behind her. When she reached him, she stopped just close enough to see the faint exhaustion in his face. "You left without telling me," she said quietly. Damien did not deny it. "I had to." Evelyn's voice tightened slightly. "You stopped your treatment." A faint pause followed. "Yes. And you left Ravensshire." "Yes." The simplicity of his answers made the truth heavier. Evelyn searched his face carefully. "Why?" Damien looked away briefly, as though gathering something that had taken years to accept. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before. "Because I realized I had been living as if survival was the only obligation I had left." Evelyn's breath caught slightly. "And now?" Damien met her eyes again. This time there was no distance in his expression, only clarity. "Now I understand that surviving without purpose is not the same as living." The words struck her more deeply than she expected. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "So you came here to what? End everything?" Damien's gaze remained steady. "I came here to finish what I could not leave unresolved." Evelyn's voice softened slightly despite herself. "And that includes me." A faint pause followed. Then he nodded once. "Especially you." The honesty of it made her chest tighten. Evelyn stepped closer. "You do not get to decide that I am something to be resolved before you disappear." Damien's expression shifted slightly. Not defensive. Strained. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you do not yet understand what follows me when I am gone from this world." She did not look away. "Then tell me." The ballroom around them continued moving, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding beneath its chandeliers. Damien's voice lowered further. "If I leave without closing what I began, you will inherit not only my name but everything that comes with it." Evelyn frowned slightly. "I already knew that." "No," he said quietly. "You know the wealth. You do not know the weight." A long silence followed. Evelyn's voice softened. "And you think abandoning everything now solves it?" Damien's jaw tightened faintly. "I think ending it on my terms prevents it from ending on theirs." The words made her still. Evelyn stepped closer again until there was almost no space between them. "You are not thinking like someone who wants to live," she said quietly. Damien did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something she had not heard before. Not resignation. Not fatigue. Something dangerously close to conflict. "I am thinking like someone who finally understands what it costs you to keep choosing survival over peace." Evelyn's breath caught slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music continued behind them, distant and unaware. Then Evelyn reached for his hand. This time he did not pull away. "You do not get to leave me inside a future you built and then walk away from it," she said softly. Damien looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she had known him, he did not have an immediate answer. The night of the Royal Winter Assembly did not feel like any gathering Evelyn had ever attended before. It felt like a courtroom disguised as celebration. Chandeliers blazed above rows of aristocrats dressed in silks and metals. Yet the atmosphere beneath the music carried a tension that no one dared name aloud. Evelyn stood near the entrance for only a moment before stepping fully inside. The moment her presence registered, conversation shifted across the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-motion. Someone even stopped mid-laugh. And then the whispers began. Not loud, not direct, but sharp enough to follow her every step. Evelyn did not slow down. She already knew why she was here. Damien Ashford stood at the center of it all. Not seated among guests. Not hiding in shadow. standing beneath the largest chandelier in the hall, as though waiting for something he had already decided would happen. He looked different tonight. Not weaker, not more fragile. Something more decisive had replaced the exhaustion she had grown used to seeing in him. As though illness had stopped being an excuse and become something he had finally chosen to confront instead of endure. When his eyes met hers across the room, the silence between them felt immediate and absolute. Evelyn walked toward him. Each step echoed more clearly in her mind than the music behind her. The crowd parted again without effort. Not because they respected her. Because they were watching. Waiting. When she reached him, she stopped just close enough to see the faint tension in his jaw. "You are not in Ravensshire," she said quietly. Damien did not deny it. "No." The simplicity of the answer made her pulse tighten. "You left without telling me where you were going," she continued. "I told you I was coming here," he replied. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "That is not the same thing." A faint pause followed. Then Damien spoke more quietly. "It is when you know what I came here to do." Evelyn's chest tightened. "And what exactly is that?" Damien did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted briefly toward the gathered aristocrats surrounding them. Then back to her. "To end speculation," he said. Evelyn frowned slightly. "Speculation about what?" His voice lowered. "About whether I am already too weak to control what will happen after I am gone." The words landed heavily. Evelyn stepped closer instinctively. "You are not here to entertain them," she said. Damien's expression sharpened slightly. "No. Then why are you standing in the middle of a ballroom like this?" A faint pause followed. Then he answered with quiet certainty. "Because they have already begun planning what they will take from you when I am no longer here to prevent it." Evelyn felt something cold tighten inside her chest. "So this is about protection again." Damien did not correct her. That silence was enough. Evelyn looked around the ballroom slowly. Every face watching them carried curiosity sharpened into expectation. "You could have handled this privately," she said. "You did not need to turn it into spectacle." Damien's gaze returned to her fully. "Spectacle is what they already created around you," he replied. "I am simply correcting the direction of it." Before Evelyn could respond, a sudden shift rippled through the room. The music faltered slightly. Conversations dropped into silence. Every head turned toward the entrance once more. A group of senior aristocrats had risen near the far end of the hall. Lord Whitmore among them. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten instantly. Damien noticed the shift immediately. "It is beginning," he said quietly. Evelyn frowned. "What is?" Damien stepped forward slightly, placing himself between her and the approaching group without fully blocking her view. "The formal inquiry into Ravensshire Holdings after my death." Evelyn froze. "That has not happened." "It has been prepared," he corrected. Lord Whitmore approached with deliberate calm, accompanied by two other men Evelyn recognized from Parliament circles. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but their presence carried authority that did not need announcement. Whitmore stopped several feet away. "Your Grace," he said formally. Damien inclined his head once. "Lord Whitmore." The tension in the room deepened instantly. Whitmore glanced briefly toward Evelyn before continuing. "We are here to ensure proper clarity regarding the transfer of certain estates and financial holdings tied to the Ravensshire name." Evelyn felt her breath tighten. Damien did not react. "You are early," he said calmly. Whitmore's expression tightened slightly. "We prefer to avoid uncertainty." A faint pause followed. Damien looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "There is no uncertainty." Whitmore hesitated. "Your condition is still considered unstable by medical review." Damien's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "My condition is not the subject of your inquiry." The words shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. Evelyn felt it immediately. Whitmore straightened slightly. "Your Grace, with respect. The stability of Ravensshire inheritance depends entirely on succession certainty." Damien took one step forward. "Not aggressive. Controlled. Absolute." "Then let me clarify something," he said quietly. The room went completely still. Evelyn watched him carefully now. This was not the exhausted man from Ravensshire. Not the man preparing quietly for disappearance. This was something else entirely. Damien continued. No transfer, no redistribution, and no interference in Ravensshire Holdings will occur without my explicit authorization while I remain alive. Whitmore's expression tightened. That is not how parliamentary trusteeship works. Damien met his gaze directly. Then change your understanding. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the music had stopped completely now. Every aristocrat in the room was watching without breathing. Whitmore shifted slightly. Your Grace, you cannot continue to operate as though illness does not affect legal oversight. Damien's voice lowered slightly. You are confusing vulnerability with incapacity. A faint ripple moved through the crowd at those words. Evelyn felt something inside her shift as she watched him. This was not defiance. It was control reclaimed. Whitmore hesitated again. We will require formal confirmation of your current medical status. Damien nodded once. You may request it. Then he added quietly, but you will not act upon it until I permit it. The finality of the statement struck harder than any raised voice could have. Whitmore's jaw tightened. For the first time, uncertainty appeared beneath his controlled exterior. Damien turned slightly toward Evelyn then, his expression softening just enough for only her to notice. This is what I came here to end, he said quietly. Evelyn stared at him. You came here to confront Parliament. I came here to remove their assumption that I am already gone, he corrected. Whitmore stepped forward slightly again. Your Grace, this level of assertion will not be accepted without consequence. Damien turned back toward him slowly. Then we will define consequence together. The simplicity of the reply left no room for argument. The room remained frozen in silence. Evelyn realized something then. This was not a man preparing to disappear. This was a man refusing to be erased before his time. Whitmore finally stepped back slightly. Not defeated. Recalibrating. The group withdrew with restrained acknowledgement, though their expressions made it clear the conflict had only shifted, not ended. When they were gone, the ballroom slowly began to breathe again. Music resumed faintly. Conversations restarted in cautious fragments. But the center of the room remained unchanged. Evelyn turned to Damien slowly. That was not about inheritance, she said quietly. Damien looked at her fully. No, it was about control, she continued. He nodded once. Yes. Pause followed. Evelyn studied him carefully. You are no longer acting like a man preparing to die. Damien did not answer immediately. Then, quietly, he said, I am acting like a man who has decided that others will not decide it for him. The words lingered between them. The chandeliers above continued burning bright, but something beneath them had shifted permanently. And for the first time since everything began, Evelyn realized the greatest change was not that Damien Ashford was dying. It was that he had stopped allowing the world to define what that meant. The silence inside Ravensshire Estate felt different the morning after the Royal Assembly. Not peaceful, not calm. It felt suspended, like the entire house was waiting for something it already knew was coming. Evelyn stood in the corridor outside the Grand Library for several seconds before entering. The doors were already open. That alone told her everything. Damien was inside. He was not seated. He was standing near the tall windows with his back partially turned, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk as though anchoring himself in place. The winter light outside was pale and distant, casting a thin silver outline around his figure. He looked steadier than he had days ago. Not healthier, not recovered. Steadier in a different way, like something inside him had finally stopped resisting its own direction. You left the assembly without me, Evelyn said quietly as she stepped inside. Damien did not turn immediately. I did not need to stay longer. You turned an entire ballroom upside down, she added. A faint pause followed before he replied. They needed to hear something before they decided everything without me. Evelyn moved further into the room, stopping near the edge of the firelight. That was not about inheritance, she said. Damien finally turned toward her. No. The simplicity of the answer carried weight. Evelyn studied him carefully. You confronted them like a man who has already chosen his position. Damien did not deny it. I have chosen not to be positioned by them. A faint shift passed through the room. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, controlled silence. Evelyn stepped closer. What happens now? She asked. Damien looked toward the fire briefly before answering. Now they stop pretending I am already gone. Evelyn frowned slightly. And after that, a long pause followed. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Not weaker. Final in a different way. After that, I finish what I came to resolve. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. You said that before, she replied softly. Damien met her gaze. This time I mean it differently. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Evelyn moved closer until she stood just a few feet away. You are still here, she said quietly. Damien's expression softened slightly at that. Not emotionally, recognitively. I am here, he agreed. But not in the same way I was before. Evelyn shook her head slightly. That does not mean you leave everything behind. Damien's gaze lowered briefly. It means I stop pretending I can control everything that follows me. Evelyn studied him carefully. Something in his posture had changed since the night of the assembly. Not physical strength. Not weakness. Acceptance of motion instead of resistance to it. You are not afraid anymore, she said quietly. Damien did not answer immediately. Then, finally, I am not afraid of what they will do after I am gone. Evelyn frowned. Then what are you afraid of? A pause followed that felt longer than it should have. Damien looked at her fully. Of leaving you inside a world I no longer exist in to defend you from. The honesty of it made her still. Evelyn stepped closer again. You are still assuming I need defending. Damien's expression shifted faintly. History suggests otherwise. Evelyn's voice softened slightly. History is not destiny. The fire behind them cracked softly. Damien turned slightly toward the window again. You think I have been trying to control everything, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. Because you have been. A faint exhale left him. No, he said. I have been trying to ensure nothing escapes my reach before I can no longer correct it. Evelyn studied him carefully. That is control. That is responsibility, he corrected quietly. The distinction lingered heavily. Evelyn stepped closer again until she stood directly beside him. You told Parliament you will not be removed from the equation easily, she said. Damien nodded faintly. Yes. Evelyn turned toward him fully. Then stop removing yourself from it in advance. A silence followed. Not tense. Not broken. Something slower. Damien's gaze remained fixed on her for several seconds. Then he looked away briefly as though considering something he had not allowed himself to consider fully before. There is something you still do not know, he said quietly. Evelyn's expression tightened slightly. About what? Damien turned back toward her slowly. About what began before Catherine. The name shifted the air instantly. Evelyn did not interrupt. Damien continued. There were investigations into Ravensshire Holdings years before I ever met you. Not formal ones. Quiet ones. Hidden through legal channels that do not appear in public record. Evelyn listened carefully. And Damien's jaw tightened faintly. And those investigations did not stop after Catherine's death. Evelyn frowned. Why are you telling me this now? Damien met her gaze directly. Because I have spent years assuming everything that followed her was inevitable. Pause followed. I was wrong. Evelyn's breath slowed slightly. Wrong how? Damien looked toward the fire again. Someone has been shaping what happens to Ravensshire for longer than I allowed myself to believe. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. And you only realized this now. Damien nodded once. No, he corrected quietly. I realized it when I stopped assuming I was the only variable in the equation. Silence stretched again. Evelyn stepped closer. You think Catherine's death was connected to this? Damien did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower. I think Catherine's death created space for it to continue without interruption. The implication settled heavily in the room. Evelyn felt her pulse tighten. And you never told anyone. There was no proof, Damien said simply. Evelyn studied him carefully. And now, Damien's gaze returned to hers. Now there are patterns I can no longer ignore. Evelyn felt a cold clarity forming. That is why you went to Parliament. Damien nodded faintly. Partly. Pause followed. And partly because I am no longer willing to let uncertainty define what happens next. Evelyn took a slow breath. So what happens next? Damien looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. We stopped treating my absence as the central assumption. The words landed differently now. Not resignation. Not preparation. Direction. Evelyn stepped closer again. We, she repeated. Damien did not correct her. The silence between them shifted. Outside, snow continued falling over Ravensshire Estate, but inside the library something had changed completely. Not certainty. Not resolution. Something closer to alignment. Damien Ashford was no longer arranging his life around departure. And for the first time, Evelyn realized she was no longer standing beside a man preparing to disappear. She was standing beside a man beginning to refuse the story that had been written for him.